Okay. um, so I wanted to describe or talk about what life is like after awakening. And try and compare it to life living in or living from and as the personal point of view, the separate position, the separate self. So before any insight or realization or shift, life is very much something that is lived by me, lived by the central character, the central subject. The subject here that relates to a life story, and it all refers back to me as the one in the centre of it. And it's very much most of our reference or most of the way that we use to orient ourselves, or most of life really, is lived through a mind, an internal mind world, an internal narrative based reflection of the senses, or a reflection of what's actually here. A reflected version of, I guess what you could say is what's real. An interpretation of life as it relates to me in thought. So there's a lot of thinking, there's constant thinking, there's constant self-referential thoughts, either directly or indirectly. Indirectly would be like, thinking about things you need to do, or life circumstances. Self-referential thoughts would be talking about yourself in your head. So we're constantly projecting forwards or remembering backwards to give ourselves a mental picture or a mental idea of where we are now, where we're going, what's going on here, how I relate to my life, and how I'm going to control that. So it's very much a sense of personal control, a sense of personal ownership or individual direction. And that narrative is constant, and it's often skewed towards the negative. It often is the mind often catastrophizes as a means of controlling for bad possible situations, as a way of, or it remembers previous undesirable, or it relates to undesirable experiences, and it projects them into the future, saying, how can I avoid this? How can I move towards more of what I like and avoid what I don't like? So really it's disconnected from direct sensory reality. It's turned in, the mind is turned in itself, and it uses an internal world, a reflection essentially, a representation of the real, of reality, to live life through. So we're never actually really, this isn't fully true, but we're never actually really fully in contact with life. We're living a reflection of life. We're living a false representation of what life, or what we think life is. And it gets very exhausting, it gets very uncomfortable and painful in ways. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of effort, and it's something that just happens on its own. It's like a survival mechanism that maybe served a purpose at one point in time, but doesn't work anymore. It seems to be based in stress, based in doubt, or based in uncertainty. And after a while, at least for myself, I can say I noticed that those interpretations of reality, those reflections, were just not accurate at all, and they continually proved themselves to be, when held up against what actually happens, or what's actually happening, nothing to do with life, nothing to do with what's actually here right now, nothing to do with it. Completely in contrast to what's actually here right now, or even what I thought, or what I remember happening, versus the projections and the doubts and interpretations. So when we get into the spiritual path, what the mind does is it takes that same old way of relating to experience and it recontextualizes it into a spiritual narrative. So we think that this awakening thing is something to do with me, the subject, the one on the journey, the one practicing the practice or on the path. And we project forwards, and we think that this is going to be a personal experience in the future that happens to me, and it's going to have these qualities desirable. Something that's not here right now, that's in the future. And then we think back to our recent memory of how we're behaving, and we think that's not spiritual. That means I'm not awake. It has nothing to do with that. It's the same old function, just applied in a different context. The center of the experience being me, the subject, the person, the individual, separate self, the character. This has nothing to do with the character. If anything, I could maybe describe it as that position from which we relate to our experience through mind starts to thin out, starts to fade away, starts to lose its reality. And what we're left with is basically just an impersonal experience. And that impersonal experience is essentially what's here anyway, in the absence of the context of the subject, the context of the individual. The thing is that this impersonal experience is so direct, so immediate, so intimate, that there's no distance to it, there's no need to hold back from and relate to it at a distance. So it's so much more close, so much more natural, so much more free. If anyone's ever, this is kind of what it's like, if anyone's ever had the experience of falling asleep, so you have a nap during the day. It tended to happen to me, having a nap during the day, and the thoughts kind of change, the thoughts kind of quiet down, and you're kind of half asleep, half awake, but there is an awareness of the immediate sensory experience. There's a kind of half awareness of sound, but that the context of that personal individual in the center of it, separate from it, has kind of been forgotten about to an extent. So you have this kind of strange, well, it seems strange from a point of view, the strange experience of intimate, immediate connection with the senses in a kind of an unusual way, it seems, in an impersonal way, in a way where the central character is absent from it. And only in retrospect, only when you wake up, do you think back, remember the experience, and think, that was weird how I almost wasn't quite there. There was just the senses. There was an awareness of and as the senses. Like, you know, what I call myself at a fundamental level was still present. But it's a really nice experience, because that constantly referring to, relating to experience, central character, just faded away for a bit. If anyone's ever had that experience before, falling asleep, it's very similar to that, except it's all the time, and it's not like a half awake, it's dreamlike state. It's a fully vivid, fully engaged, let's say, experience. But that's pretty much the same thing. Difference is that, you know, we may have an awakening experience that changes everything. We may have a spiritual experience that really changes our perspective on things. But as long as that has continued to be recontextualized into a personal narrative about me, a personal quality and ownership of my own experience, it's never a true shift. You could say permanent, but it's never a true awakening, because that tendency is still there, and the belief is still there, that strong function is still there to contextualize this into my experience, my awakening, my shift in consciousness. Even though the direct experience of that, or directly that experience, is exactly what I'm always talking about, is the awakeness, is the awakening, you could say. It's what's added to it after, in reality, as felt to be real. Until that function in its reality fades away, falls to bits, there's never really a lasting shift in perception, or a lasting awakening, I guess, a rubbish language, but, and so language is going to start failing right now, okay, so take all of this with a pinch of salt. But the difference between let's say, if I'm going to categorize them, for the sake of pointing, for the sake of understanding, the initial awakening, what's realized directly, what I'm always talking about, which I can't describe, is so direct that it kind of invalidates a lot of the identity structure in various ways, but aspects of that identity structure tend to remain until this deepens. And when this deepens enough, I guess you could say that by default, reality abides as itself, without having to this language is ridiculous, without having to maintain this separate position in itself as something separate. So I'm avoiding saying you abide as awakeness or whatever, because that language isn't quite, it's quite misleading. This abides as itself, without a felt realness of this separate character, this personal ownership of me and my experience. That's it. What's tasted directly is it's because there seems to be like a disconnect between the thing that feels like me, that through mind can understand concepts and understand a personal narrative and how I relate to this, how I relate to that. What's realised is almost completely out with that, or it's before that, or it's what that is made of. So by definition, the central character, the separate self, can't come close. It's impossible for it to be able to comprehend the absolute, being a relative construction, being something that isn't complete, being something essentially is an illusion, isn't real. But those deeper automatic tendencies tend to roll on in various ways, and that's why I have some certain videos where I'm pointing to very deeply held assumptions about the nature of reality that we don't even know we're making when we're caught up in this ID narrative, such as there is space, there is time, things that once were thought to be the fabric of existence, the fundamental nature of reality, just a given. That I am the perceiver, I am the observer of my experience, that I occupy a position within reality, a position within my life. It's a radical thing to challenge these assumptions, and it's actually quite frightening to do so, because in doing that personal identity then seems to lose its grip of reality, lose its grip of being oriented in this as something. And there seem to be inbuilt defense mechanisms that might even trigger a fight or flight response, because if the mind body perceives the, let's say, noticed absence of space and time as a form of death, as a threat. So there seems to be this proprioception, this energetic physical feeling of me here, that when it's noticed that that's not actually there in the way that we thought it was, of course you feel like you're dying, you feel like you're losing yourself. I'm tangenting off here, but as this deepens, it becomes harder and harder to talk about. But essentially, life becomes not about living a reflection, not about living as a me, discrete from the rest of the world, as an entity that relates to the world through thought and identity. It just becomes sensation. And as this identity deconstructs, the sensation becomes more vivid, to the point where you just can't describe it. It's beyond words. It doesn't need a description. And in the sensation, directly, what's actually here, not a reflected version of what we think is here, but what this actually is. Everything spontaneously resolves itself, happens on its own. Everything's so, I could say it's interconnected, but that wouldn't be true, because there would have to be separate parts for it to be interconnected. This direct experience becomes more and more direct more and more immediate, to the point where everything's so mushed up together, like such that there aren't separate points in time, there aren't separate positions in space, there aren't a separate anything. There's just one sense, one seamless, infinite, seemingly paradoxical sense of life. Any position that we could take in order to relate to reality, to understand it in the sense of being something separate from it, loses its inherent felt reality. So then reality just becomes one sense. You could say it's like, if you were to describe it like the sense, God's sense, if you're inclined to use that language, the one universal sense. And it just becomes impossible to describe, but in that there's no problem. In that everything takes care of itself. It's seen that you can't take a position in order to manipulate reality as something separate from it, so you just give up doing that. You see that wasn't even possible in the first place. So then it's a great relaxation, and it's free in a way that I can't even describe. It's not a concept of free. I can't describe how, in what way it's free beyond your imagination. It's limitless beyond your imagination. It's formless beyond you. It's just ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. Whatever this is, just becomes. I can't describe it. I just can't describe it. There would be no point in describing it, because you just need to, I would say, experience for yourself, but that language fails as well. And it never gets, it's not possible to get for reality to be bored with itself. It's not possible for this to get diminish in its awesomeness. It's just non-stop, but it's never overwhelming. It's not a personal experience. It's not something that's happening to me. It's not a personal quality or an attainment. It's completely nothing to do with you as a character or me as a character. Doesn't matter. Nothing to do with that whatsoever. And that's just the way it is, and that's just the way it always has been. And it's clear that there's no other way, or there isn't even a way it is. But it's certainly not what you think it is. It's certainly not a personal experience. It's not something I experience as something separate from the experience, whatever that is. It's just not like that. It's too unified to be like that. It's too pure, too natural, too immediate, too whole. So if all of this is happening on its own, with there being no possibility of an imagined entity central in this, no possibility of that ever being able to control or exert its will in any real way on what's going on, then what is there to do? Life goes on, but what is there to do as the one in it? Nothing. So it's over. The whole thing's over. The whole spiritual journey, over. Never happened. Anyway, I'll need to go now. But that's my best attempt at describing what it's like before and after awakening. Let me know what you think. I'll talk to you next time.